Hello, my name is Michael Crillian. I'm a practicing planner and urban designer. And this is a presentation relating to the generational objects, icons, architecture and collections, the object lessons in the work of Douglas Coupland. So in a complex and rapidly changing world, Douglas Coupland has recorded, described, narrated his way around multiple different creative disciplines. And I think the dominant theme of the work appears to relate to this idea of accelerated culture and the rate of change within society, part of the postmodern tradition, being culturally self-referencing, concentrating ideas, exaggerating ideas, and ironically reinventing ideas. And his writing and his artwork have always been full of slogans and references to this sort of popular culture or popular consumerism culture. So in addition to these zeitgeist references, the appearance of artifacts and objects throughout his work that I think are representative of his organization and understanding of popular culture and consumerism. So this interest in artifacts relates to the selection, their organization and the representation. It became apparent to me in introduction to his book The Souvenir of Canada, where he uses this visual mode of still life to photograph stuff, that he considers things and artifacts to be more significant than just mass-produced objects and that are in some way representative of national sensibilities and identities. And this postmodern method is repeated and made explicit in later conversations about collections of stuff, the pathology of how they're organized and displayed. And there appears to be a common method of representation and organization of stuff as cultural icons used within his writing, where the consideration of post-industrial age media and objects are all representing something bigger than just their substantive value. He's using iconic or representative objects that have a wider shared understanding to ironically enrich or exaggerate. And it's even been suggested that he uses the novel as a form of literary museum to host a series of personally or nationally significant objects within a storyline. So as a result, Coupland has been described as an accomplished lifestyle taxonomist. And he's also admitted directly that he's looking for meaning in everything all the time in patterns, just like an artist. He looks at information overload with a goal of pattern recognition to see things before anyone else. So this presentation is part of an investigative inquiry into this idea of the process of collecting, organizing, representing objects or artifacts. And we're using examples of selected objects from both his fiction and non-fiction works over the last 30 years, albeit we've got a particular reference on his views of architectural objects. We explore this idea of Coupland's writing as a collection of notable objects as much as a collection of ideas. And in addition to the selection of objects, is the significance of his ontological approach to classifying and organizing these in a combination of tacit and explicit ways. So the idea is to develop a formal ontological framework to develop it, to visualize this for some of these selected objects, to test the notion that there's some sort of underlying pattern to this process. And this presentation also suggests that throughout his writing and visual art, Coupland follows a very similar curatorial approach and process to the inclusion of significant objects that are representative of zeitgeist, and in his selections he is in part helping define the era, the time, the place, or the generation. So the working criteria for the selection of the objects we're using here, the artifacts, is based on inclusion with his own writing or artwork, together with an accompanying director or explicit quotation within his own words, although in practice this appears to be a bit more fluid as a definition because of our partial remembrances and discoveries of artifacts and objects, which have caused revisions and iterations throughout the work. So in setting out to superimpose some sort of classification system, what is essentially my personally biased sample of objects have been referenced from his writing. I'm well aware there are limitations, but the best practice is to be explicit about this and to describe the criteria used in this emergent ontology. Although there is no current international status for classifying Douglas Coupland's work, we've started from a classification based on nomenclature, which is an updated version for documenting describing artifacts from museum collections, and that allows you to look at both digital and analog references. It's a classification system based on people, places, technology, and generations. Initially, we're looking at recording the name. And this could be the name of the artist, with recording of the individual name. It could be a recording of the name of the maker, which requires an individual or specific name. But there's also the option to record an association with an eminent figure or organization directly associated with the object through the use or the possession. And that requires the named individual, but allows for a rich potential for semantic connections to be made. Recording the place is just the location of the object or the artifact and the place of manufacture, including the district, the city, or the country if applicable. And again, that requires the actual individual specific. The technological classification is a criteria for objects that seemed essential given Coupland's interest with Marsh & McLuhan and the post-electronic age where technology and medium as a message is so important as an extension of our existing human senses. So one key decision here was whether to classify the media or the dominant sense receptor. Although in recording the individual specific, we have to be aware that technology is also an indicator, an alternative to any given time period. It reminded me of Alvin Toffler's questioning the ability to keep up with rapid change. He quoted that the future will have arrived too soon as new technology has a positive feedback on the pace of innovation, and that further accelerates the rate of change. In looking at digital technologies, McLuhan suggested the structural impact of the technology in society that the city no longer exists except as a cultural ghost for tourists, in the sense that any highway tree with a TV set, newspaper, or magazine can be as cosmopolitan as New York or Paris. So essentially it's an important criteria, if only for its undermining of the fundamental purpose and functionality of cities and the alternative place-based classification mentioned earlier. And again, we need to record the individual or the specific. The generational classification is a wee bit more contentious. Coupland said that the whole generation thing is actually silly in the first place. If you have to assign a psychographic to someone who's X and N, if you like the Clash, the Talking Heads, and Depeche Mode, you're an X. It's that simple. But if you're like Depeche, you're not. It's also been suggested that Coupland's writing and objects have been organized chronologically and by nostalgia. So he still uses timelines to reconstruct the lives of his biographies. So it's a useful mechanism for classification around date, historical or cultural periods when the artifact is a representative of type, a form, or style of a distinctive period. But we have to record that time or that period. So in sampling the artifacts, this investigative inquiry into objects follows a broadly chronological sequence of Coupland's own timeline rather than his sequence of published works. And one key decision we made was to restrict the sample size to 30 to acknowledge the 30th anniversary of the publication of Generation X. And what became apparent in going through this process is the repetitive and self-referential nature of their objects and the themes. But the place to start here is the Word Book Encyclopedia, which is a 1970s source material that introduced Coupland into pop art. Specifically, Andy Warhol's Campbell's Tomato Soup, The Artifact 2, and The Image of Blam by Roy Lichtenstein. Both works clearly making the association between words and objects. About this, Coupland said it was the first time he had looked at words, and the word itself, Bam, became an art object. My sensibility is very pop, and I look at words as more than just a word. I look at them as art supplies, but I also look at them as objects as well. I share, in part, this personal history being brought up in a household with royal books. My childhood using royal books was a slightly less expensive and less Anglo-centric choice than the Encyclopedia Britannica. But here we see one of the earlier references to experiences of dealing with organised information, with Coupland being enthralled by words as objects. The fourth artifact was chosen is the fax meme of Marsh & McLuhan's memorial, suggesting this is an analog meme based on words, based on an object. And here the concept of a meme is a unit of information. It was first introduced as a metaphor by the author Richard Dawkins in his book The Selfish Gene in 1976, and further developed by Susan Blackmore into, quote, a unit or element of culture that is passed on by imitation and duplication. So it's the pop cultural and social media applications in common recognition that have dominated our understanding of how memes are used within public conversations, with the result that the origins have been obscured a wee bit over time. But the characteristic of a digital meme is how intertextually or referencing self and other popular memes. It's understanding layers of cultural references, and it requires us to look beyond the trivial and understand the utility of the meme and the ability to communicate this meme. And the reason this meme facts, or the facts meme resonates to me is that in the introduction to Susan Blackmore's book, Dawkins himself writes an introduction, and he speculates on a research method about the spread of a meme. In his example, the visual representation of Chinese whispers where a series of children are asked to draw a Chinese junk and pass on the drawing to the next child to copy, potentially to demonstrate the inaccuracy in replication, and potentially being the problem with the ultimate success of any meme. And it's surprisingly similar to what Douglas Coupland did with an example of mutation of information from his exercise while working as a copywriter in his trade magazine called Vista. And this was a business magazine where Coupland actually created the celebrity facts of the month, the dead celebrity in this case, post 1981, where it's adapted and degraded through an extended sequence of technological Chinese whispers, if you like, between different fax machines. It's also worth acknowledging that the Vista magazine, where Coupland worked for a year or two, also hosted the first Generation X comic strip, which was a collaboration between a Toronto-based illustrator. Moving from one magazine to another, we found Western Living magazine, Artifact 7, which was a regional lifestyle journal where Coupland worked for a short period around 1987, but gave a lasting impact regarding the idealism and optimism of suburban or edge living. So much so that the design featured on the cover. This Ron Thom designed house dating from 1962 was actually purchased by Coupland in 1994 and considered so Canadian and so pure Vancouver in its modern rigid geometry that it featured in his Souvenir of Canada collection. The geometry itself seems to be significant, as a blogger's review of his home, Coupland commented that he collects shapes, and this seems to be he's collected the building, which was at the time at risk of demolition, to be added as a collection of shapes, with his house becoming a domestic gallery next door to his primary residence. The suburbs in the Edge City reappears in his postcard for Los Alamos, where he references a group of Chevy Suburbans with blacked-out windows as the introduction to the suburban environment, one of several within this collection of postcards. So the Chevy Suburban is representative in effect of some of these idealized urban cultures, most significant and most notable in the collection being Brentwood, a portrait which can be viewed as an ontology of the present, an ontology of our moment in history that simultaneously reflects an ontology of ourselves. So it seems as an argument that postmodern, post-suburban have been connected and addressed here, and with several other parts in his fiction on fiction writing. It's a term that planetary architects are kind of aware of, but the dominant subculture of the place is of the edge city, an edgy frontier-like environment, rather than the social hierarchical culture of post-war suburban. So the form and the identity of the post-suburban place is central to his edginess of his ideas about place. Legos are a repeating theme in a lot of Coupland's work, and so clearly is the Lego Modern House Kit number 345, where it formed a central piece of a reproduced retro assembly of 100 kits. It smacks of associations of growing up utopian, mass production, social betterment, and overtly modernist, low-density suburban forms. And in reflecting about these associations, Coupland felt that, as a 12-year-old boy, use of the product goes into dormitory, and it reminded him of the house he lived in. It was his first and last as Alpha and Omega Lego kit. It was repeated in format when describing his project Lego Towers, which was an experimental timecode for a period in his life. It was a crowdsourced cluster of Lego blocks that were randomly attached to each other. And later on, plastic figures came boxed with the first signed edition of J-Pod that included a Lego cover design of the main characters, possibly an extremely unsubtle way of saying that the book and the tech industry is populated by plastic characters. Artifact 13, Super City, is a similar installation as a combination of plastic architectural toys, this case inspired by a 1967 kit created by Ideal, which is clearly modernist with a modular construction method and reportedly unbelievably better than Lego. And the stylist associations with the Californian Modern, in this case the case study houses 16 by the architect Craig Elwood, and also I would argue with Will Alsop's contemporaneous exhibition installation about Super City, which imagined the scale of Los Angeles conurbation stretching across the M62 corridor in northern England. The suburban Paramus Park Mall in New Jersey appears in Shampoo Planet, where I think the most attractive idea here is running throughout the novel is the idea of a personal shampoo museum, with the plastic bottle being purchased from this park mall in New Jersey, described by Coupland as one of Earth's 4 great mall fortresses. Although it's interesting to note in passing that there's actually a shampoo museum or a museum section at the Smithsonian which makes a link between beauty products and the culture of consumerism. So moving on from the shampoo collection, the association between plastics and places starts to find form here, to be repeated in different works, including a Guardian article from 1999, where he tells a story of shopping in a Tokyo department store, walking down a household cleaning products aisle, and had what you call an ecstatic moment where the tinted plastic bottles on both sides of the aisle temporarily froze my cortex, pink, yellow, baby blue, turquoise, so many cute looking bottles. So he bought 125 bottles, took them back to the hotel room where he emptied them down the toilet. And this collection of plastic trash ultimately took the form of an art installation, 108 plastic bottles collected from Tokyo Harbour. No word here of what happened to the other 17 bottles. And these were eventually displayed at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2000, seeming to demonstrate to many commentators and reviewers the fascination with the material culture of a society and indicative of progression to more substantial and politically activist territory, dare I say environmental sensibility. And so clearly linked to this is his collection of bottles, is the Vortex, which was exhibited at the Vancouver Aquarium. It's Coupland's collection of marine garbage, and explicitly a reference to the specific trash vortex or the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And its appearance, I would argue, is actually a major character in The Worst Person Ever, the continent of plastic trash you've been reading about for decades, the largest man-made object on the planet, makes you proud and disgusted about being human all at the same time. As often mentioned in Experience Directory, the internet's futile for finding an appropriate image that adequately represents the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So likewise, Coupland's response to visualizing it as installation is overwhelming in its scale, and it requires a selection of a representative object that was made from plastic, that came from Japan, and floated in the water like a buoy. This repeating fascination with plastic waste has also been evident in the use and abuse of chewing gum as a subject of a theft, where the protagonist of the novel swiped a packet of Wrigley's Orbit chewing gum from the rack up front and spent the morning chewing every piece one by one, placing the resulting gum wads onto some display racks. Talk about life on the edge. Quote. And this quote from The Gum Thief is virtually a set of instructions for the crowdsourced creation Gumhead, which is a collection of second-hand chewing gum placed over a 2-meter high resin and polyester head of the artist as an interactive self-portrait to form part of a major retrospective. Like Coupland said, seeing it all together felt like I was walking around in my own brain. And then Coupland, in discussing waste, I guess the future garbage, said that the moment you declare an object to be garbage, it immediately enters the past tense and it becomes instant archaeology. And the parallel treatment of words as objects, words are also recorded and then they are erased. Occasionally only the fragments survive, only the shards, and maybe a few stray words here and there, and maybe that's all that's ever required. So perhaps the most Significant and least subtle expression in this retrospective, this obsession with collecting and organizing stuff, is his work, The Brain, a strange assembly of over 5,000 objects in a very personal arrangement, suggests how his own brain functions in response to storing and organizing a 2-decade longitudinal collection of stuff starting in 1994. Here the organization is random and unruly. There are a number of high-profile architectural projects that appear through his works, starting with the CN Tower in Toronto, as perhaps the best known of the architectural icons of Canada that are referenced in his guides intended for Canadians, and how the national identity is imbibed and imbued in the built artifacts such as the CN Tower or some of the more innovative designs around the Expo 76 of the Montreal Olympics. However, alongside this interest in national identity is the architecture of technology, and one of these, the Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, is known as the Idea Factory, and in itself holds a collection of historical technological artifacts in its own right. Quoting, the high-ceilinged concrete spaces filled with artifacts with astonishing significance. The world's first transistor, the world's first laser, a replica of the world's first satellite. Even when Coupland is actually writing about the building as an object, is laced with this reference to a museum catalogue as representative of the internet itself that leads into his reflections of the history of technology and some of the future challenges around managing the rising tide of information, not drowning in a sea of tsunami of data. So Coupland is starting to make some connection between digital and the physical manifestation indeed of the internet that increasingly referred to in the context of energy consumption and one of the triggers for the age of earthquakes. And this interest has been expressed when referencing the Apple headquarters in California, about which Coupland says, "This is the first time I've looked at a building and actually gone, wow, in quite a while." And it seems clear that these ICT companies have informed the setting for Microsurf's and JPod. And JPod itself, a TV show, was ultimately filmed around the quadrangle of Simon Fraser University campus, British Columbia, designed by Arthur Erickson in 1963. Itself as a brutalist icon of that era with a retro-futurist or timeless look, and I feel it makes it a popular choice for science fiction film locations. Collectively, these ICT companies and their buildings are manifestations of the wired brain, the place where data is ultimately organized, or at least where the organizational systems are established. Coupland said, "I don't think people at any of these data firms are sitting in their chairs, tapping their fingertips together, gleefully crackling from a sense of power. They're mostly just trying to invent new ways of reformatting data. I wish that they could use their data to better understand the human soul." So we began the selection of artifacts with an encyclopedia, and it's slightly symbolic to bookend it with this growth of information technology. Interestingly, Tom Wolfe said when IBM discovered that it wasn't in the business of making office equipment or business machines, but it was in the business of processing information, that it began to navigate with a clear vision. So in effect, the future isn't actually about technology, but rather the way we manage information. Artifact 26 I've included as a spin-off to the activities of the ICT companies is Hot Coffee. It's a hidden mini-game set within the digital San Andreas Grand Theft Auto, and something that was semi-scandalous at the time as a visualized experience of, in italics, going back for coffee. The discovery which actually required the reassessment of adults-only ratings within the main game. This hot coffee was used as a suggestion for the creation of a red light district to win the Board X game as part of the JPod TV series. I suppose hot coffee is as significant as a recurring digital trope that brings with it adult themes association, extends some of the earlier ideas that Coupland had about adult themed pixels expressed about Lara Croft and about the love affair with popular culture and video gaming. And so I've used a coffee or a set of styrofoam coffee cups preserved from the opening of Canada House exhibition to represent the Fawn's collection, which is a collection of boxes full of objects. In the language of information and archival sciences, a fons is understood as a collection of writings or objects that share the same source that have grown naturally from the work of an individual or of an agency. And to me this seems to be a great summation of a collection that has stopped short of hoarding, that's lacking any clear ontological structure, at least initially, other than being able to identify the source of the materials. In the University of British Columbia's Library Rare Books and Special Collections description of these funds, it talks about major literary works, personal and artistic photographs, visual art materials, collages, paintings, printouts, digital collages, maquettes, items of clothing, leather goods, technical notes and designs, websites, conceptual sketches, designs, correspondence and other records. What's more interesting to me is the description of the arrangement of this collection, in that, quote, much of the material had little arrangement. An initial inventory arrived with the boxes, and each original box contained items related to many aspects of Coupland's activities, and were from a particular time period identified by Coupland. There was no other apparent order within each of the boxes. So in organising this collection, the archivist used information gathered from what they call a deposit interview with Douglas Coupland himself directly, and the multiple challenges that popped up. The most significant was probably experimental deployment of a taxonomic subject terms. So they ended up needing to delete, move, or modify some of the tags in order to make a cohesive taxonomy, because they were working with, quote, a new functionality. So to me it seems to be a significant degree the artifacts and objects associated with Douglas Coupland are almost unclassifiable without his personal input, or perhaps even with it. And maybe it's at this point we should try to give up trying to make this classification at all. So I'm starting to analyse this importance of things, the values attached to these cultural Coupland artifacts, I think are much more than just the economic utility. They're consumed against their implicit values. They have a second life through sharing platforms. They give us meaning through materialistic associations. And interestingly, the common factor in all the academic discourses is that we still express our identity through what we own, the representative artifacts, what we share through mementos, and what we're able to access through our digital platforms. It may also be the case that our attitudes to the inherent value of artifacts are generational, inasmuch as millennials hold significantly less stock in things compared to experiences. So in part due to collaborative consumption and the sharing economy, being able to say that enough is enough. So with this changing generational attitude to artifacts and ownership, in parallel with the rise of digital sharing platforms, and part of any cultural value of these selected objects is then about understanding the postmodern cultural references and associations. Like in a city, the metaphor becoming central concepts within linguistics, within epistemology, but also in other areas of the science of communication and cognition. We need to clearly reference a need for semantic understandings in addition to any physicality of objects. So I would argue to understand the work of Douglas Coupland, we have to appreciate the postmodern verve. We've got to recognise the development of dadaism techniques that have been applied to these collections of stuff, where there's concentration, there are mashups, there are blurring boundaries between disciplines, and where ideas are presented as collections. His books are as much a collection as any grouping of artifacts that use mixed mediums. They're full of ideas and objects that all have semantic associations of personal significance to the author or the artist. When Coupland was writing about organising the words and the work of Marshall McLuhan, he spoke of ontological cul-de-sacs. I suppose that's part of my response to his collection and methods of organisation. Maybe that his brain, his collections of stuff, his tacit ontology looks just like the internet in the sense that it's crowdsourced, it's full of semantic hot links that are simply subjective and personal. But what is clear is the need to visualize the structuring of ideas through his work, and then to share this structure to make it openly visible for analysis. And so his semantic connections of associations are weighted by influence and chronology in Artifact 29, 50 books I have read more than once, which is a sculptural installation in the most visual and open manner, dating from 2007. So one question I had asked myself is that objects are a replacement for the lack of faith, given that Coupland described Generation X as being the first generation to be raised without religion. Determinedly not the case in my experiences of growing up in Belfast in the 1970s. But one final admission, I guess, is that I've never read Generation X in spite of obsessing about everything else produced by his hand, by his brain, ultimately saving the best from last from the pre-digital universe. So I've chosen Artifact 30 as the book itself, or more specifically, the 1996 reprint with a pop art cover, so we can begin and end with pop art. The fact that I haven't read it is similar to Coupland's reference recently. He said he's deliberately not read the book for 18 years now because he'd be forced to have a relationship with it again. The 30 years since the publication of Generation X probably represents at least a pathing the growth of one more generation. And we should probably expect generational changes in attitudes to artifacts, objects, and consumerism, particularly with the growth of digital material and artifacts. So very hard to sum up, other than to go back to the original structured ontology of this collection. And then to realize that while there's a lot of diversity, the common factor is actually the generational references that hold everything else together. They're objects and artifacts and ideas and words grown out of a particular generation. So thanks for listening, and hopefully it'll give you enough interest to read the paper that accompanies this presentation. Thank you.